The spider's mark, Commander Daniel Cross had been carrying the coin for 12 years. He turned it over in his fingers, now alone in his temporary office at Naval Special Warfare Center, Coronado. Outside the Pacific moved in the dark the way it always moved, without urgency, without interest in what men were planning on its shores. The desk lamp threw a circle of light across the metal surface, and Cross held the coin inside that circle and looked at it the way he had looked at it hundreds of times before, in offices and cockpits and spare billets on 3 continents, in the particular way a man looks at something he has decided to carry but has never decided what to do with. The coin was not standard issue. It had never been part of any official program. Someone had pressed it into his palm on the floor of a UH-60 that was losing altitude at 300 feet over a valley in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, in March of 2009. Cross had been 26 years old then, a lieutenant junior grade on his 41st combat mission, flying a bird that had taken 2 rounds through the tail rotor assembly and was demonstrating with mechanical honesty what that meant for its continued airworthiness. He had flown into that valley because 18 men needed extraction. He had flown out with 7. The man who pressed the coin into his hand had not been one of them. Cross moved the coin beneath the lamp. The engraving was precise and deliberate, not the mass-produced look of a challenge coin sold at a base exchange, but something made with intention and care. A black widow spider at the center, its legs extending outward across a web of geometric lines so fine they might have been laid with a surveyor's instrument. 7 small stars arranged in a loose arc beneath the spider's body, and woven into the web itself, barely visible unless you knew to look a set of coordinates. 35 degrees, 41 minutes north. 71 degrees, 23 minutes east. Korengal Valley, Kunar Province. The valley that had no name on any map cleared for general distribution. He had memorized those numbers in the first week after the extraction. He had looked up the location the way you look up the address of a place where something terrible and significant happened to you, not to return to it, only to confirm that it occupied a real point on the earth and not merely a point in your own accounting of things you owed. 11 men had died in that valley. Wade Harmon had been listed among them according to the after-action report filed by Cross's squadron commander, according to the official records forwarded through proper channels, according to the letter that had traveled to a family in Raleigh, North Carolina, and changed everything about how that family understood the world. Cross had never questioned the listing. Operators died in classified operations. The paperwork that followed such deaths had its own logic and its own requirements, and the requirements did not always include the kind of accounting that surviving people found satisfying. You did not ask questions that required answers that could not be given. He had filed his own report. He had described the figure who stepped out of cover on the valley floor to provide suppressing fire while the helicopter fought its way off the ground. Controlled 3-round bursts, deliberate movement between positions, the discipline of a man who was spending himself carefully buying seconds with precision rather than panic, understanding exactly what he was doing and choosing to do it anyway. Cross had written the name his crew chief called out in the last seconds before the aircraft cleared the ridge. Wade Harmon, DevGru Red Squadron. The report said Harmon did not survive. Cross pressed his thumb flat against the coin. Tomorrow morning at 05:30, he would stand at the edge of a formation of 180 SEAL candidates at the start of a new training cycle. He was here at the request of a flag officer who had concerns about the program's evaluation protocols, a secondary assignment, quiet, the kind of oversight that senior commanders conducted without announcing, because announced oversight changed the behavior it was meant to assess. He would observe. He would make notes. He would write a report that would sit in a file somewhere and either matter or not matter, depending on factors above his current pay grade. He was not expecting anything unusual. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. He placed the coin in the left breast pocket of his uniform shirt, close to the bone where he had carried it for 12 years. He turned off the lamp. Through the window, the Pacific moved in the dark. The California morning came in cold and clean off the water. The sky still held the last of the night's dark blue along the horizon. When the formation assembled at 0527, 180 candidates standing in lines that were almost straight, the almost straightness communicating something about where they were in the process of becoming what the training intended to make them. Cross stood back from the line of instructors, hands at his sides. He had spent enough years in enough environments to know how to occupy a space without advertising his attention, how to look from a distance like a man whose mind was elsewhere, while everything in his field of vision was being registered and filed. He saw her within the first 30 seconds. She stood at rigid attention in the 3rd row near the right flank of the formation. 5'3" compact, her combat shirt's right sleeve rolled to the elbow despite the morning chill. On the inside of her forearms, stark against skin that carried the particular weathering of someone who had spent time outdoors in serious conditions, was a tattoo, a black widow spider. Something moved in Cross's chest. He kept his face still and his body where it was. Sergeant Ryder Cole had already seen it. Cole was broad through the shoulders with the physical authority of a man whose size had settled most arguments before they became arguments, and an instructor's instinct for the place and a candidate where pressure would produce the most visible result. Right now, he was applying that instinct in a way that had nothing to do with an instruction and everything to do with performance. His voice carried across the training ground at a volume calibrated for maximum audience, not loud enough to seem uncontrolled, loud enough to ensure that no one within 40 meters missed a word. He was talking about the tattoo. He was asking questions designed to sound rhetorical but land like accusations. He was doing what such men do in such moments, establishing the terms of an audience before the subject has had a chance to establish her own. The woman did not move. Not her eyes, not her jaw, not the alignment of her shoulders. Cross watched her chest and counted. 4 counts in. A pause. Out slowly. It was the breathing pattern of someone who had been taught to manage a body under targeted pressure, not someone managing by instinct alone, but someone who had learned the technique and practiced it until it was available in conditions where instinct was insufficient. That was a distinction that mattered. Her name, he would learn from the roster that evening, was Kate Harmon, 29 years old, 5 years of conventional Navy service. A record that was clean and unremarkable in the particular way of records that have been carefully maintained to be exactly that. No red flags, no commendations that would draw attention from any direction, nothing that told you who you were actually looking at. Cross had learned over many years that the most revealing thing about a service record was sometimes what it did not contain. He made a single notation in his log. The first evolution was a 5-mile run. Cole positioned himself 3 rows behind Kate at the starting line. Cross positioned himself at the 2-mile checkpoint with a clipboard he did not need and the patience of someone waiting to see what he had already begun to suspect. The formation moved. 180 sets of boots on pavement produced a sound like weather building. The first mile ran on adrenaline and the self-image each candidate had carried into the starting position. The second mile was where the body stopped deferring to self-image and began reporting actual conditions. Kate was in the top quarter at the 2-mile mark. Her stride was economical in a way Cross had learned to recognize over years of observation, not the stride of someone trained for a fitness test, not the efficient machine movement of a competitive runner, but the ground-covering practicality of someone who had run long distances under load in real conditions enough times that running had become a tool rather than an effort. There was no performance in it. She was not running for anyone watching. She was simply moving from where she was to where she needed to be. Cole was behind her and working harder than he should have been at this pace. He had increased his speed to stay ahead of her. The attempt had registered in his shoulders and jaw by the 2nd-mile marker. By mile 3, he had dropped back. By mile 4, Kate had moved to the top 15% without any visible change in her cadence. Cross wrote nothing about her ranking. He wrote about the economy of movement. He wrote about the absence of the anxiety response that candidates almost universally displayed when they understood they were being closely observed in a hostile environment. He wrote not managing the situation, operating within it. She finished in the top 12%. Cole crossed the line 40 seconds later, bent forward with his hands on his knees. When he straightened his face, held the expression of a man who has committed publicly to a conclusion and encountered evidence that does not cooperate with it. He would not revise the conclusion, but the evidence had entered him and it would work on him in the dark the way inconvenient evidence works on people who are not yet ready to examine it. Master Chief Owen Briggs stood near the finish line, 51 years old. 28 years of service carried in the way that such service is carried by people who have never needed to announce it in economy of movement, in the quality of his silence, in the way he watched things without appearing to watch them. He observed Kate cross the line. He observed Cole cross the line. He made one notation in his log and said nothing to anyone. Cross, observing from across the finish area, watched him do it and felt the thing in his chest again, more insistent now. Against the north wall of the observation area, a petty officer named Tess Halford was completing a routine equipment inventory. 24 years old, 8 months on this base. She had learned the specific navigation that women learn in environments where the default assumption is that you are present temporarily and belong elsewhere permanently. She was not watching the run with any particular intention. But she had been watching it, and she had noted Kate's time, and she had noted Cole's time 30 seconds after that, and she placed these two numbers together in the quiet interior way of someone who has not yet decided what to do with an observation, but has decided to keep it. The weapons qualification began after a recovery period shorter than the candidates would have preferred. Instructor Jack Mercer ran the evolution with the dry efficiency of a man who had said most things many times and saw no reason to dress them up. Standard assessments. Disassembly function, check marksmanship, protocol. The candidates performed within the expected range. Then Mercer called Kate to the front. He placed an M4 carbine on the table. Field strip, 2 minutes. Kate's hands found the rifle without searching. The upper receiver separated from the lower in a single fluid motion. Not the careful deliberateness of someone applying learned procedure, but the fluency of someone for whom the procedure had become reflex through repetitions too numerous to count. The components laid themselves out on the table in sequence. 47 seconds. Mercer looked at his stopwatch. He looked at it again. He said, "Do it blindfolded." A low sound moved through the room. Contempt from the people expecting failure, suspended attention from the people who were not entirely sure what they were about to witness. Kate accepted the blindfold without comment or change of expression. Her hands moved to the disassembled components and began to read them the way you read a language you learned early enough that you no longer experience it as translation. 49 seconds. The weapon was assembled. She removed the blindfold. The room held a silence with a different texture than the silence that had preceded it. Mercer moved to the adjacent table and set down a second weapon. An M249 squad automatic weapon, significantly more complex than the M4, a different operating system, specialized knowledge, not scheduled for this phase of training. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. This was not assessment. This was an architect designing a public failure framed as additional challenge. Cross-observing from the doorway did not watch Kate. He watched her hands. Her right hand moved to the receiver with a motion that belonged to a different category than anything the room had seen from any candidate this cycle. This was not applied knowledge. This was the physical memory that accumulates through hundreds of repetitions in conditions that make each repetition matter, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body independently of thought placed there at some earlier time in some other context available now without requiring retrieval. She had held this weapon before, many times before. Gas regulator, barrel assembly, bolt group, feed tray mechanism, each component released in correct sequence, laid out with the unconscious organization of someone for whom the process had a grammar they did not need to consciously speak. 43 seconds to disassemble, 45 to reassemble. She stepped back from the table and waited. Mercer said nothing. He walked to the far end of the armory and made himself occupied. It was the movement of a man who needed distance from data that had outrun his available categories. Grant Ellison, the observation officer assigned to document the training cycle's performance metrics, stood near the back wall with a log that was already denser than observation logs typically were in the first week of a cycle. He had been watching Kate since the morning run. He underlined the timing notations twice, drew a line connecting them to his earlier notes about the run, and said nothing to anyone. Briggs stood along the wall with his eyes on Kate's hands. He had not moved, had not written anything, but something had settled in his expression, not surprise exactly, but recognition. The look of a man whose picture has just acquired a piece that makes the rest of it legible. Cole's voice filled the silence before the silence could make its own argument. Someone had coached her, he said. Advance access to the materials. It didn't happen otherwise. The words moved through the room and found the people who needed them. Diana Voss, standing near the north wall with her arms crossed, nodded. Voss had earned her position through years of accumulation, small advances made against resistance, a room made in a space that did not make room easily. The discipline required for that kind of progress included a strategic clarity about who was ally and who was competition, and the calculation that Voss had run on Kate Harmon since the first morning of the cycle had produced a result she was not willing to revise. She did not entirely believe Cole's explanation. She needed it to remain available. Kate said nothing. She had been in rooms where things were decided about her before she had done anything to deserve a decision. She had learned not to spend energy on the decision-making of others. She spent it instead on the only currency that eventually mattered, the accumulation of evidence that spoke without requiring her to raise her voice. That evening, while the training cycle ran its social calculations in the mess hall and the barracks, Kate went to the pistol range alone. The Pacific light in late afternoon had a quality specific to that coast, warm and horizontal, making ordinary surfaces look considered throwing shadows long enough to cross the entire range. She loaded and fired and reloaded with a rhythm that was not fast but was continuous, the physical grammar of a practice maintained for its own sake and for the sake of what it would be needed for. No performance in it, no audience required. Tess Halford was assigned to range maintenance. She had orders to stay in the equipment shed and not engage with training personnel. She stayed in the equipment shed. She had a window. She watched Kate work through 3 magazines. She noted the speed and the grouping and the complete absence of any motion that was not necessary. She had been on this base 8 months, and she had been on ranges before that, and she had not seen anyone move through a reload sequence with that quality of economy, not the speed of competition, but the efficiency of someone who had learned that every wasted motion in a serious environment was a cost assessed against something that mattered. She turned back to her inventory and held the observation in the quiet interior space where she had been holding things about Kate Harmon since the first morning of the cycle. On the 3rd day of training, Cross found what he had been looking for, and it was not what he had expected because he had not known he was looking for it. He was on the elevated observation platform at the north end of the training area watching a building clearance sequence. 3-person stack. Standard enough. Kate's group reached a hallway junction, and Kate used her left hand to signal. 4 fingers extended, thumb folded across the palm. A specific rotation at the wrist that distinguished the signal from any variation that could be interpreted differently. Cross went still. He had seen that signal once. A closed briefing in 2008, limited attendance, no windows, no recording devices. The session had covered the operational protocols of DevGru Red Squadron unit-specific communication systems developed for environments where standard signals had been found to produce specific vulnerabilities. The rotation at the wrist was the differentiator that distinguished the signal's meaning within the unit's internal lexicon. It was not in any manual. It was passed inside the unit through use, through the kind of practical transmission that requires proximity and repetition and cannot be achieved through documentation. The only way Kate Harmon knew that signal was if someone from that unit had placed it in her hands. Cross's right hand moved to his chest. He felt the coin through the fabric of his shirt. He stood on the platform for a long time with the specific stillness of a man rearranging the structure of what he thought he knew. Then he came down and walked toward the administrative building at a pace that communicated nothing to anyone watching, and he went to his temporary office and closed the door. He placed the coin on the desk. Wade Harmon had a daughter. This was in the background file, a standard fact unremarked upon filed in the same category as date of birth and place of enlistment and all the other facts that accumulated around a life without necessarily illuminating it. Born 1992, 29 years old. He had never done anything with this information because there had been no reason to. He looked at the coin, a daughter who had a tattoo matching this coin with a precision that required either extraordinary coincidence or direct inheritance. A daughter who used hand signals from her father's unit. A daughter who disassembled a weapon she had not been taught to disassemble with the muscle memory of someone who had done it in real conditions. A daughter who had a service record containing none of this. Cross held the coin for a long time. Then he made a call to a number that was not in any directory. 4 rings. No answer. He left no message. He put the coin back in his pocket. In the morning before the 0530 formation, he would find Kate Harmon. He needed to understand what she was doing here. He was already understanding that it was considerably larger than a training cycle. That night, in the hour after lights out, Kate sat on her bunk in the dark. She thought about Raleigh. Her mother was 61 years old and taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school where Kate had learned to read, in the same building where Wade Harmon had attended a parents' night 22 years ago and had stood in the hallway with his dress uniform drawing questions from other parents who did not know what a DevGru operator looked like in person. Margaret Harmon had not slept a full night since March of 2009. She did not say this directly. She expressed it in practical questions. Was Kate eating enough? Was she keeping warm? Was she taking care of herself? And in the frequency with which she answered on the 2nd ring. 6 months ago, at the kitchen table in Raleigh over coffee, in the hour before Kate's flight departed, Kate had said, "I will come home." She had said it with the specific weight of a statement made by someone who understood exactly what they were committing to, which meant she also understood the conditions under which it might not be kept. Her father had made a similar promise to her mother once. She did not follow that thought to its conclusion. She thought instead about what her father had told her at a range in North Carolina when she was 15 years old. He had set the weapon down and turned to her with the particular seriousness of a man who needed to be understood precisely. He had said, "The things I am teaching you are not for showing. They are not for competition or recognition or proving anything to anyone. They are for the moment when you are the only person in a room with what is needed, and the cost of not using it is something you cannot accept. He had paused. When that moment comes, you will recognize it. Until it comes, you keep this between us. She had kept it through 5 years of service in conventional roles. She had kept it through the first 3 days of this training cycle, through Cole's manufactured contempt and Voss's calculated social architecture and Shaw's quiet interventions with her equipment interventions. She had noticed and documented and said nothing about. She had kept it because the mission required it to be kept. The mission required her to appear ordinary until the evidence of the extraordinary could no longer be contained, because data collected from a system that knew it was being observed was worthless data. The only valid evidence was the system operating as it operated when no one with authority was paying close attention, unguarded, unmodified, behaving according to its actual assumptions rather than its stated ones. She thought about the women who would come after her. She thought about them walking into rooms like these rooms, hitting walls, like these walls, and she thought about what it would mean if those walls remained, and what it would mean if they came down. And she made the calculation she had made many times before, and it came out the same way. She closed her eyes and breathed the way her father had taught her to breathe. In the morning, Cross would be waiting. Part 2 would fire. Cross found her in the corridor outside the equipment storage bay at OIS 6:15 in the narrow interval when the administrative building held only duty staff and the silence of a space between demands. He said her name once. She stopped walking. A half-second pause, the pause of someone who had learned not to go through doors without understanding what was behind them. Then she turned, and her face was exactly what it had been in every observable moment across the past 3 days. He told her quietly that he needed a few minutes in a space where they would not be observed. She considered him for a moment with the steady assessment of someone reading the distance between what was being said and what was being meant. Then she followed him. The office faced north, away from the training ground. Sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, a lamp. Cross sat. He opened the center drawer and placed the coin on the desk between them. He said nothing. Kate looked at the coin. In the 2 seconds after she looked at it, something moved through her face that had not appeared there at any point in the preceding 3 days. Not the controlled non-response she had been delivering consistently in public, not the carved stillness that had absorbed Cole's performances and Shaw's sabotage and Voss's social warfare without visible cost. Something fractured briefly in the specific way a surface fractures under sudden thermal stress. The crack visible, the structure holding, but the evidence of pressure undeniable. She had not expected to see this here. She had not expected anyone on this base to have it. Cross let the silence work. She made the decision to end it first. She said she could not confirm or deny anything related to that coin's origin or the operation it referenced. Cross said he was not asking about the operation. He had filed his own report 12 years ago, and he knew what the official record contained, and he was not here to revisit either document. He was asking why the daughter of the man who had pressed that coin into his hand in the last seconds before a damaged helicopter cleared a valley in Kunar province was standing in a SEAL training cycle, performing at a level that bore no relationship to the service record attached to her name. Kate looked at the coin for a moment longer. Then she looked at Cross. She said, measuring each word before releasing it, she was here to collect data. Every evolution, every evaluation, every incident of deliberate interference, and every moment of institutional resistance that had nothing to do with her demonstrated performance and everything to do with assumptions made before she demonstrated anything. All of it was data. The program did not know it was being evaluated. That was the only condition under which the evaluation was valid. The moment she revealed her actual credentials, the system would adjust its behavior, and adjusted behavior was not the behavior that needed to be on record. Cross sat back. He understood the architecture of it immediately, a controlled test designed by someone who knew that an observed system behaves differently than an unobserved one, who had therefore created conditions in which the system would operate according to its actual assumptions rather than its performed ones. The genius of it was also its cost. It required her to absorb without response everything the system deployed against people it had decided it did not want. He had been watching the system deploy those things for 3 days. He had written about them in his observation log. He knew what they had looked like from the outside. He did not want to know what they had looked like from the inside. He told her about Sandra Kelly. Kelly was an intelligence officer with a secondary assignment monitoring security anomalies in high-clearance training environments. She was effective at identifying statistical patterns and less effective at contextualizing them. The performance data from Kate's first 3 days had triggered an automatic flag in a monitoring system designed to catch exactly the kind of impossibility Kate's numbers represented, a candidate performing at the 92nd percentile in weapons handling during a phase of training that had not yet reached weapons qualification. The system had generated an alert. Kelly had received it. Kelly had forwarded a preliminary inquiry to Captain Holt's office. Holt had received it with the energy of a man who had been waiting for a formal mechanism to accomplish something he had already determined to accomplish. Kate's expression did not change while Cross spoke, but behind her eyes something was recalculating the reassessment of timelines, contingencies, available options. He watched it happen and said nothing because it was her calculation to make, and she was clearly capable of making it. What he did not see, because she did not allow it to show, was what came before the calculation. She was thinking about Raleigh. Her mother at this hour was probably at the kitchen table with coffee she had poured and forgotten about grading papers or staring at papers without grading them, inhabiting the particular wakefulness of a woman who had already paid the highest possible cost for another person's mission and who was now waiting every night to find out whether she would pay it again. 6 months ago at that same table, Kate had said, "I will come home." She had said it with full understanding of what she was committing to, which meant she had said it with full understanding of the conditions under which she might not be able to keep it. The shoulder was already compromised. A fragment from a 2019 operation, the details of which lived in a compartment of her service record that her official file did not reference, had done damage that a surgical repair had addressed adequately, but not completely. The physicians at Bethesda had documented the incomplete resolution and their recommendations clearly. She had read the documentation and filed the acknowledgement and signed what needed to be signed. She had done all of this understanding that the final evaluation, if it went the way such evaluations sometimes went, when they were designed to produce a particular result, would load that shoulder in exactly the way the documentation said it should not be loaded. Her father had faced a version of this arithmetic on a valley floor in Kunar province. He had made his calculation on the basis of what the mission required rather than what the people who loved him needed. She had spent 12 years moving toward a complete understanding of why that calculus had looked the way it did from his side of it. She understood it fully now, for the first time sitting across a desk from the man who had flown the helicopter that her father had stayed behind to protect. She said to Cross quietly, "The timeline has to move." Cross looked at her. He did not ask about the shoulder. He did not ask about her mother or the calculations she had just completed or what they had cost her. He was a man who had made similar calculations and understood that some decisions lived between a person and what they were willing to lose, and that the correct response to such decisions was not interrogation. He said he would ensure the final evaluation proceeded. Kate nodded once and stood and left. Cross sat at the desk with the coin in his palm and thought about Wade Harmon, about what it had required and what it had cost to produce someone capable of this. Captain Holt moved the timeline that same morning. He announced it in the 700 staff meeting with the administrative briskness of someone implementing a decision that had already been made, explained with the selective vagueness of someone whose actual reasoning required concealment. The final evaluation for the current cycle would be advanced. It would take place at 0400 in 2 days. All relevant personnel were to be notified. Mercer asked about preparation time. Holt said candidates who needed extended preparation time had already communicated something about their readiness. Cross made a single notation in his log. The meeting continued. Cole received the notification and responded with the focused energy of a man who had just been handed the conclusion he had been working toward. He spent that afternoon and the following morning walking the training structure, a multi-story building, configured for urban combat scenarios, mapping positions, and adjusting his opposition force deployment with the thoroughness of someone who understood the difference between a training exercise and a designed outcome. He placed responses to every conventional approach: front entry, side entry, second floor windows, rooftop access. He walked the building twice and was satisfied. Every approach he had considered was covered. The ventilation shaft on the northeast face of the lower level did not register as an approach. The technical manuals described it as inaccessible for personnel movement, 14 inches at the narrowest point. No training evolution in the facility's history had used it as an entry point, because no training evolution had required entry by someone who had been taught beginning at age 12 by a man who understood that the spaces no one watched were almost always the spaces that mattered most. Cole did not know about age 12. He did not know about Raleigh. He knew what the manuals said, and the manuals said inaccessible, and Cole trusted the manuals. He was thorough. He was experienced. He went to sleep the night before the evaluation certain. Tyler Shaw made his most significant intervention the evening before the evaluation in the briefing room, while the base was running its late routines and the training materials for the following morning's evolution were accessible in the storage bay. His earlier work had been careful. The punctured canteen, Kate had replaced it without comment. The adjusted equipment strap, she had corrected it during her pre-evolution check, noting nothing in any report. These were the moves of someone who understood plausible deniability, who had done the arithmetic on what could be proven and what could only be suspected. What he did to the briefing materials was different in kind. The site map in the evaluation packet showed a grid reference for the primary hostage location. Shaw altered the reference. Not substantially would be detectable on casual review. He changed it enough. The error directed a rescue team toward a room on the third floor that the opposition force deployment designated as its heaviest firepower concentration. A team that went to that room first would walk into a prepared kill zone before neutralizing anything else in the building. Dana Merritt found it at 2240. She had been returning borrowed equipment to the briefing room storage bay and had checked the materials as a matter of the habit she had built over 9 years, the habit of someone who had learned that the difference between a clean operation and a compromised one was frequently a detail that someone paying adequate attention would have caught. She stood with the packet in her hands and understood exactly what she was looking at. She had reported things before. She understood what reporting cost in environments where the institution would prefer to absorb the problem quietly rather than examine it openly. She had paid that cost once at a previous assignment, and the payment had refined her sense of when to speak and what form the speaking needed to take. She went to Kate's billet at 2310. Kate opened the door 30 seconds after Merritt's quiet knock. Fully dressed, fully awake. Kate read the packet in the time it takes to read something you already understand the structure of. She handed it back. She said, "Remember exactly what you found, where you found it, what time. Keep it precise. Don't write it down anywhere." Merritt said she would. Kate said, "Put it back exactly where you found it." Merritt looked at her for a moment. Kate said, "This is evidence. Not just of the pattern. The canteen, the strap. This. One incident is explainable. A documented pattern requires a different explanation, and the explanation is what the report needs. Filing tonight ends the documentation and produces a complaint. Waiting and submitting with full context produces a finding." She paused. "The finding is what changes things for the people who come after us." Merritt understood. She had understood the principle before Kate articulated it, but hearing it articulated confirmed that the patience she was being asked for was not patience for its own sake. She put the materials back where she had found them. Kate spent 40 minutes alone in the briefing room making a separate careful record of the grid discrepancy and preparing the corrected materials she would use for the actual evolution. Then she returned to her billet and lay in the dark with the shoulder that was going to be loaded tomorrow, whether she wanted it to be or not, and the promise she had made at a kitchen table in Raleigh and her father's voice from a range in North Carolina saying, "When that moment comes, you will recognize it." She recognized it. She breathed. 4 counts in. A pause. Out slowly. She slept. The formation assembled at 0355. Not yet dawn. The base lights threw a flat functional illumination across the training ground, the kind that showed you what was directly in front of you without context or warmth. 140 personnel had come to observe. Some came from curiosity. Some came from a simpler motive, the anticipation of a conclusion they had decided was coming and wanted to see confirmed. A smaller number had been watching for 4 days, with the growing discomfort of people whose working hypothesis was not surviving contact with the available evidence, and who were present because they needed to know what the evidence was going to do next. Master Chief Briggs stood at the perimeter without a clipboard, his hands at his sides, his attention on the building, in the way that someone who has been in buildings like it at hours like this for non-training reasons directs their attention. Cross was in the observation tower. Grant Ellison stood at the left edge of the observation line with his log open, though he had not written anything in it for the past 20 minutes. He had been reviewing his accumulated notations from the past 4 days and arriving with the methodical certainty of someone who does not permit himself to reach a conclusion before the evidence supports it at a conclusion. Kate's team assembled near the staging area. Ward, Halford, Merritt. Ward had the focused quiet of someone who had made a decision about something and was not second-guessing it. Halford stood still with the attention of someone who had been watching carefully for 4 days and was now ready to see what it had been preparation for. Kate ran the briefing in under 90 seconds. Not a speech information. Entry point movement, sequence, communication protocol, contingency. If communications failed, primary objective, secondary objective, abort condition. Each element delivered with the precision of someone who understood that ambiguity in a briefing was a cost paid later at the worst possible time. Ward asked one question. He asked how she knew the ventilation shaft was viable. Kate looked at him. She said, "My father told me that the spaces no one was watching were almost always the spaces that mattered most. He taught me how to use them when I was 12 years old." She paused. "Follow my signals exactly and we'll finish this in under 9 minutes." Ward did not ask a follow-up question. The clock started. Part 3, 7 stars, nobody moved. Not Cole, who was still holding the shape of the grip he had released from Kate's vest. Not Voss, who had taken 3 involuntary steps backward before she registered the motion. Not the 140 people on the training ground outside who were doing the arithmetic of what they had just witnessed and finding that the answer exceeded the range they had been prepared to accommodate. The evaluation clock on the wall display read 11 minutes and 29 seconds. The hostages were secured. The opposition force was neutralized. The mission was complete. In any other circumstance, these facts and the numbers that represented them would have been sufficient to initiate the standard post-evolution protocol. But the torn vest was real. The tattoo fully exposed beneath the early morning light was real. And these things were operating on the people present in a register that the clock and its numbers could not override. The tattoo visible now in its entirety was not what most of them had seen. They had seen the Black Widow spider, the element Cole had used as his opening instrument on the first morning of the training cycle, the thing that had been mocked and made into a social transaction before Kate had done anything to earn or deserve a transaction of any kind. What they saw now was that the spider was only the center of a larger design. The web surrounding it was not decorative. The lines were coordinates laid with the precision of someone who understood what coordinates meant and had chosen this way of carrying them. 35 degrees, 41 minutes north, 71 degrees, 23 minutes east. Below the spider's body and characters fine enough to require proximity to read WH70309. And beneath everything, 7 stars arranged in a loose arc that matched no constellation in any catalog. Cole's face moved through expressions faster than he could manage, them confusion cycling into recognition, cycling into something that had no clean name. The expression of a man watching the organizing principle of his recent behavior collapse from beneath him. Voss stood with one hand over her mouth and her eyes conducting an inventory of the past 4 days. Every rumor planted, every doubt distributed, every calculation made about who Kate Harmon was before Kate Harmon had done anything, an inventory whose balance she could not look at directly. Holt stood at the edge of the crowd with the expression of a man watching something he had built on, with considerable effort, disassemble without being asked. Mercer was not looking at Holt. He was looking at the coordinates on Kate's arm. He had been deployed in eastern Afghanistan in 2010, and he knew those numbers the way you knew numbers that marked a place where significant things had happened, not from studying them, but from proximity to the events they referenced. He had read the after-action summaries, the sanitized versions, the ones that contained enough to give the location weight without explaining what had actually happened there. The weight was present now fully. Grant Ellison had stopped writing in his log. He closed it. He was looking at Kate with the expression of someone whose picture has just received its final piece and become a picture. Briggs walked forward from the perimeter. He had not spoken in any public moment across the 5 days of training. Not once. He had observed and noted and accumulated his understanding with the patience of someone who had learned over 28 years of service that the value of speaking was directly proportional to the discipline of not speaking when speaking was merely satisfying. He walked to the center of the space where Kate was standing and looked at the tattoo and then looked at the code below it. He turned to Cole. His voice carried without volume in the way that some voices carry through the quality of attention they command rather than through decibels. He said, W.H. Wade Harmon, 7 survivors, 0309, March 2009. He said nothing else. He turned and walked back to the perimeter. The people in the crowd who carried clearances sufficient to have encountered any reference to the operation that had officially not survived its own classification moved in the way people move when they hear something confirmed that they were not certain they wanted confirmed. The people without those clearances looked at the faces of the people with them and understood from those faces that something had just been named that carried a weight none of them had been prepared for. In the observation tower, Cross was at the front of the platform. He came down the stairs at a pace that communicated nothing beyond deliberate intention, crossed the training floor, and stopped in front of Kate Harmon. He came to attention. The salute was parade ground precise. Not the functional exchange of military courtesy, not rank acknowledging rank. The kind of salute that a man gives when the debt he carries is older than the gesture required to honor it, when the gesture is the only currency he has for a payment that cannot otherwise be made. Not authority deferred to, not hierarchy maintained, but sacrifice recognized across 12 years by the only person present who had been there for the thing being recognized. He said in a voice level enough to carry without being raised, Lieutenant Commander Kate Harmon. I flew the extraction at Korengal Valley March 9, 2009. I reported your father killed in action because the situation required a record and the record required a name. I have carried his coins since that night. He paused. I understand now why he stayed. Kate returned the salute. She held it a beat longer than protocol required. Then she said, he told me about your flight before he left for that deployment. He said a pilot who makes a second approach under fire is telling you something about their character that no other test can measure. She paused. He was right about most things. Cross said he was right about all of it. Around them, the crowd held its silence with the quality that large groups hold when they have collectively witnessed something that resists immediate categorization. Not suspended exactly, but gathered all of its attention, organized around a single point. Caleb Ward was standing 3 feet to Kate's left, 19 years old from Georgia, who had asked one honest question before the evolution and had followed the answer without reservation. He was looking at Kate with the expression of someone revising a very large number of prior assumptions simultaneously and finding the revision not painful, but clarifying the look of someone young enough that their model of the world can still be rewritten by evidence, which was cross-thought, watching him rarer and more valuable than it appeared. Halford stood on Kate's right with the steady attention of someone who had been watching carefully for 5 days and was now watching the thing she had been watching toward arrive. She did not look surprised. She looked confirmed. The formal procedures moved with the efficiency that military institutions apply to the documentation of their own failures when the organizational benefit of minimizing them has been removed. Sandra Kelly arrived at 0452 with her tablet and a clearance confirmation that had reached her inbox 17 minutes earlier, routed through channels she had never previously accessed. Kate Harmon's records contained classified material operating at a level her monitoring system had not been designed to account for. The statistical anomalies in the performance data were not the product of deception. They were the product of a service history that her system could see the outside of, but not the inside. She withdrew the administrative hold, made the appropriate notations, and said directly to Kate that she had been performing her assigned function correctly. Kate said, you caught a genuine anomaly and escalated through proper channels. That's exactly what the system needs people like you to do. Kelly nodded and left. Dr. Paige Hayes found Kate in the medical bay at 0630. Hayes was the base medical officer, direct, efficient, with the specific economy of communication that develops in physicians who have worked in field conditions where precision was the kindest thing you could offer a patient. She had examined Kate during in-processing 5 days ago. She had noted in careful clinical language the presence of scarring inconsistent with standard training injuries, healed entry and exit wounds, surgical evidence at 3 sites, the accumulated record of a body that had been in circumstances the official service record did not describe. She had filed her observations accurately and said nothing to anyone because the right moment to use information was not always the first moment you had it. Now she looked at the way Kate was holding her right arm and began her assessment without asking permission. She said the posterior capsule repair from the 2019 fragment was adequate for most operational parameters. This exceeded those parameters. She paused. The range of motion you recover with appropriate therapy will be functional. It will not return to what it was. Kate said she had read the risk assessment before she signed it. Hayes said, I know. I'm not here to relitigate your decision. I'm here to document it accurately because an accurate record serves you better than any alternative. She worked through the assessment with efficient care. When she finished, she handed Kate the preliminary documentation. She said you knew the cost and accepted it. That's in here. It matters. Kate folded the paper carefully. She said my father had a principle. A decision made with full knowledge of its cost was the only kind of decision that meant anything. Hayes looked at her. Kate said he was a particular kind of person. Hayes said, I can see that. Then she returned to her documentation and did not say anything else, which was exactly the right thing. Holt came to find Kate at 1100 hours. He was alone. He had clearly prepared for this in some private way, not rehearsed exactly, but considered the manner of a man who has conducted an uncomfortable internal inventory and arrived at a position he did not enjoy occupying. Kate was in the equipment bay doing left-handed inventory work when he appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment. He said, "I owe you an accounting." He said it like a man paying a bill he had been avoiding, not dramatically, not with performance, but with the flat honesty of someone who had decided that honesty was the only available form of integrity left to him. He said, "I built an evaluation designed to produce a specific outcome. I used every administrative mechanism available to me to reach that outcome. I was wrong about the capability. I was wrong about the approach. Those are two separate failures, and I want you to understand that I know they are separate." Kate set down the clipboard. She looked at him. She said the capability failure was available to correct from day one. The approach failure is the one that required 5 days of documentation to make visible. The approach failure is why I'm here. Holt nodded. She said the report I'm submitting will include what you designed and why and how it was implemented. That record is not punitive, it's structural. It exists so that the next person who comes through a program like this doesn't encounter the same architecture. She paused. What you do with your part of that is your business. Holt stood with this for a moment. He said understood. Then he left. Kate watched him go and returned to the inventory. Cole found her at 1400 in the same equipment bay. He came alone without announcing himself in advance, without the infrastructure of a prepared speech. He stood in the doorway in the manner of a man who has traveled a significant distance to arrive at a position he did not start from. Kate did not stop working. She made a notation with her left hand slower than it would eventually be developing. Cole said, "I didn't know." He said it the way accurate things are said when they are insufficient, not as an explanation, not as a justification, but as the honest starting point of a reckoning that had nowhere else to begin. Kate set the clipboard down. She turned and looked at him directly. She said, "Now you know." Cole waited. She said, "Carry it forward, not the story, the knowledge. Backward doesn't help anyone coming after you. Forward does. There are people coming through programs like this one in the next year and the year after that who need what you carry to have changed." Cole stood with this for a long moment. He nodded once. Not performance commitment. The movement of a man who has received an instruction and has decided to follow it because he has understood why it matters and because it is the only response available to him that does not add to the weight he is already carrying. He left. Kate returned to the inventory. The left hand was slower at every task it was learning. It would get faster. Her father had told her that the body was a patient student when you gave it accurate feedback in enough time. He had told her that the mind's impatience was the primary obstacle to the body's capacity to learn. She breathed and continued and let the hand find what it needed to find. General Margaret Dunn arrived at Naval Special Warfare Center at 16:15 without announcement. She was 61 years old with the authority of someone who had carried it long enough that it had become structural rather than performed. She came with a staff officer and a driver and walked through the base with the directional efficiency of someone who had been to many bases and understood that the correct path to your destination was the direct one. She sat across from Kate in the small office Cross had arranged and placed a folder on the desk between them. She said, "I read your preliminary evaluation materials this morning. I want to be direct with you about what I think they show. The individual incidents are not each catastrophic. What is catastrophic is the accumulation, the evidence of a system that has organized itself without explicit direction around the assumption that certain people cannot meet standards that they demonstrably can meet, and that adjusts its response to evidence not by revising the assumption, but by discrediting the evidence. That is not a training problem. It is an institutional problem. It requires institutional solutions." Kate said she understood. Dunn looked at her for a moment with the evaluative attention of someone who has spent decades distinguishing performed understanding from real understanding. She appeared satisfied. She placed her hand on the folder and then moved it. She said, "Your father's final after-action report from Kunar Province, filed March 14, 2009, held in a classification compartment that required a specific sequence of authorizations that had not been assembled simultaneously since the day it was filed." She paused. "I assembled them this morning." She said, "The operational content remains classified and will remain classified. The final section does not. Your father wrote it after the operational reporting was complete. He addressed it to you. He wrote it because he understood he would not be submitting it through any channel that would reach you in any normal way." Kate touched the folder. She opened it and turned to the final section and read, "What those pages contained remained private in the specific way that the most important communications remain private not because their content was secret, but because the people they were written for carry them in a space that does not require external description to be real. She read for 7 minutes. Dunn waited with the patience of someone who understood that the correct response to such a moment was the absence of intervention. When Kate looked up, her face was what it had been in every observable moment since the first morning of the training cycle. Not absence of feeling, the presence of someone who has processed what required processing and is present for what comes next. Dunn saw it and recognized it for what it was and said nothing about it because nothing needed to be said. She said instead, effective immediately, your rank is commander. The paperwork was processed this morning. There is no formation. There is no ceremony. The record is updated and the designation is real. She said the task force assignment will be transmitted through formal channels in the next 72 hours. You will have authority to redesign integration protocols across all special operations training pipelines. You will have resistance from people who are good at their BMS and sincere in their belief that they are defending something worth defending. Your work is to demonstrate that what they are defending is habit rather than necessity. Kate said she understood the work. Dunn stood and extended her hand. Kate took it. The handshake lasted exactly as long as a handshake between two people who respect each other requires, not brief enough to communicate brevity, not extended enough to communicate performance. Then Dunn collected her materials, left the folder on the desk, and walked out of the office. Her steps moved down the corridor and diminished, and the building returned to its quiet. Kate sat alone. Then she stood and picked up the folder, with her left hand holding it with the care you give something that belongs in a specific place and deserves to arrive there without damage. She walked outside. She found a quiet corner of the administrative perimeter where the bass noise was distant and the Pacific was audible, and she called Raleigh. Her mother answered on the second ring. Kate said, I'm still here. Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then I know she stopped. I know. Kate said, I can't explain everything on this call. There are things I chose to do that had costs, and the costs were real, and the choosing was mine. I need you to understand that, and I will explain what I can, when I can, and I will come home. Her mother was quiet for a moment. She said, your father used to say something like that, before deployments. The same kind of thing. Kate said, I know. Her mother said, are you hurt? Kate paused for exactly 1 second. She said, I have a shoulder injury that's going to take time to rehabilitate. I'm going to be okay. Her mother said, how long until you come home? Kate said, not immediately. But I will. Her mother said, that's what I needed to hear. That's enough. Kate said goodbye and stood with the phone for a moment after the call ended, looking at the water. Then she went to the pistol range. The range was empty at 17:30. The light came from the west at the low angle of late afternoon on the California coast, warm and specific, throwing long shadows from the target frames. The sound of the Pacific was faint and steady in the background, the patient rhythm of something measuring time in units larger than any human concern. Kate stood at the firing line with her right arm in the brace Hayes had fitted that morning. She loaded the magazine with her left hand, each round seated with the attention of someone relearning a grammar in a language they already spoke, not frustrated by the slowness, not performing patience, simply giving the process what it required. Then she raised the pistol and fired 12 rounds. The grouping was acceptable. Acceptable was accurate. Acceptable was where you started. Her father had told her that accuracy was the foundation and speed was what you built on it. You did not build on a foundation that was not yet solid. You built the foundation first without hurrying it, and then you built. She ejected the magazine and loaded another. Better. The hand was finding its coordination, the way hands found coordination when you gave them accurate feedback in enough repetitions to learn, rather than demanding performance before learning was complete. She loaded a third magazine. Tess Halford appeared at the edge of the range at 17:55. She had not been invited and had not announced herself. She came because 5 days of watching had produced in her a quality of attention that needed to continue what it had started. Not urgency, not imposition, but the directed awareness of someone who has understood something important and wants to remain in its proximity. She stopped 30 meters back from the firing line. Kate did not turn. She had heard the footsteps on the gravel because she had been trained to hear footsteps on gravel, and she registered Halford's presence and its distance and its quality, still respectful, not requesting, and she continued working. She fired. She adjusted. She fired again. The grouping tightened. Her tablet was on the bench to her right, face down. She had been leaving it there, finishing the magazine, before allowing herself to read what had arrived through the channel she recognized. She set the pistol down and turned the tablet over. The message had routed through the encryption protocol of a program that had been officially inactive for 2 years. Someone had maintained the keys. 7 names. Tess Halford, standing 30 meters behind her at this moment on the gravel in the late light, having walked to this range because 5 days of watching had produced in her an instinct towards something she could not yet fully name. That instinct, the capacity to move toward what mattered before you could articulate why it mattered, was rarer than most demonstrated skills and could not be manufactured from materials that did not include it. Caleb Ward, 19 years old from Georgia, who had asked one honest question before the most important evolution of the cycle and had followed the answer without reservation, without needing the answer to be easier than it was. Young enough that his assumptions could still be rewritten by evidence. That was a quality with a limited window. It needed to be used. Dana Merritt, who had stood outside a door at 2310 on a Tuesday night and had chosen the harder option, the one that served the mission rather than the immediate relief of action. The discipline of patience in service of something larger than the present moment was what the work required more than almost anything else, and Merritt had demonstrated it under conditions that made the demonstration real. Grant Ellison, who had been building a picture in his observation log for 5 days, refusing to reach a conclusion before the evidence supported it, continuing to look when most people had settled into an interpretation. Intellectual rigor applied honestly without regard for the conclusions it might produce was not common in any environment. Owen Briggs, who had spent 28 years becoming someone whose one public sentence delivered at exactly the right moment carried the weight of everything that had preceded it. Economy of means. Deployment of what you had accumulated precisely when it would do the most work. This was a quality that could not be taught directly. It could only be recognized and given room. Dr. Paige Hayes, who had seen a body's history in a medical bay on the first morning of the cycle and had filed it accurately and said nothing to anyone, understanding that the right moment to use information was not always the first moment you had it. Precision in service of the mission rather than in service of the immediate situation. Medical expertise that understood its context. And Nora Vance, ghost, active, location classified. Kate had been told about Vance 11 months ago in a building in Northern Virginia that did not appear in any directory by a person whose name she would not record in any document. Vance had been operating undercover for 3 years in an environment that required sustaining a fiction indefinitely without losing hold of what was real beneath it, the kind of environment where you were assessed and dismissed and underestimated repeatedly, where you absorbed all of it and used it rather than being diminished by it, where the cost of the mission was paid continuously and in forms that did not appear in any accounting. The assessment compiled on her described specific capabilities. It also described the conditions under which those capabilities had been demonstrated. The conditions were not unlike the ones Kate had spent 5 days documenting. Vance was not waiting to be found. She was waiting to be recognized. There was a difference between those two positions, and it mattered, and Kate understood it at a register that was now personal, in a way it had not been personal 11 months ago. Below the 7 names, 3 words. They're ready? Recruit. Kate read the list once more. She placed the tablet face down on the bench, picked up the pistol, and loaded a fresh magazine with her left hand. Behind her, Halford took 3 steps forward on the gravel. Not to the firing line, just 3 steps closing the distance from 30 meters to something less in the careful way of someone who does not want to impose, but wants to be available. Kate fired. The round hit center of the grouping. She did not turn. She said to the range and the failing light, and loud enough to carry to Halford, "My father had a principle. He said the body was a patient student when you gave it accurate feedback in enough time. He said the mind's impatience was the primary obstacle to the body's learning." She paused. "He taught it to me at a range in North Carolina when I was 8 years old." Halford was quiet for a moment. Then she said what was his name. Kate said Wade Harmon. She loaded another round. She said he died when I was 17. "He left me something more useful than grief." She fired. The grouping tightened. "He left me the understanding that the work outlasts the person doing it, that the mission moves forward whether or not you're present for it, that what you pass on matters more than what you receive credit for." She set the pistol down and turned around. Halford stood in the last warm light before full dark in the specific posture of someone who has been watching something important for a long time and has finally understood what they have been watching toward. Kate looked at her. She said, "I need to talk to you about something. Not tonight, tomorrow morning, 0600, before the base is fully awake. Bring your service record. Not the official one, the accurate one. Halford said, I don't know what that means. Kate said, yes, you do. She held Halford's gaze for a moment, not a test, not a challenge, just the direct attention of someone confirming what they already know, and then she turned back to the firing line and loaded the final magazine of the evening. She fired. She adjusted. She fired again. The light on the water had gone from orange to the deep blue that precedes full dark. Stars were accumulating above the Pacific in the way stars accumulate, first a few boys, then more, then too many to count the record of distances and times so large that the lives lived beneath them were visible only in accumulation. The base ran its overnight routines in the middle distance, the machinery of an institution doing what institutions did, independent of what had been set in motion on a training ground that morning. Kate fired the last round. She held the empty pistol in her left hand and looked at the target. The grouping was tight. Not what the right hand had built over 20 years of work and repetition and the specific pressure of real conditions. Better than the left hand had managed that morning. The left hand was learning. It would continue to learn. The body was a patient student when you gave it what it needed. She began breaking the pistol down for cleaning. The coin cross had pressed into her palm that afternoon was in her left breast pocket close to the bone where he had carried it for 12 years. She had placed it there when he gave it to her without deliberation in the instinctive way of someone who understood what the location meant and chose it because understanding requires no deliberation. Her father had pressed it into Cross's hand in the last seconds before a helicopter cleared a valley in Kunar province. Cross had carried it for 12 years because he did not know what else to do with it. Now she was carrying it, and she knew exactly what to do with it. She would carry it until the work it represented was complete, and then she would pass it to someone who would carry it further the way the most important things move through time, not through monuments or ceremonies, but through the hands of people who understood what they were holding. She cleaned each component with the attention it required. Thorough, unhurried, the work complete before the reassembly. Tomorrow at 0600, Halford would come back. Kate would tell her what she could tell her. She would give her the information she needed to make a real decision, and she would let Halford make it because that was the only kind of decision that meant anything. Over the following weeks, she would find moments with Ward and Merritt and Ellison and Briggs and Hayes, the patient work of recognition that required unhurried attention and the willingness to let people understand what they were being offered before they were asked to commit to it. She would find a way to reach Vance through the channel that was already open through the people who maintained the infrastructure of the program that had been officially inactive and was now quietly something else. 7 names, more to come. The number mattered less than the quality of what each name represented and the quality she had been watching accumulate for 5 days in people who had demonstrated it under conditions that made demonstration real. The shadow that Wade Harmon had cast across a valley in Kunar province in March of 2009 had been long enough to reach this moment, long enough to reach the coin in his daughter's pocket and the tattoo on her arm and the 7 stars that carried his initials and the date of the last decision he made. Long enough to reach the folder that had waited 12 years in a compartment for the authorizations that would release it to the person it was written for. Long enough to reach a training ground in California where a system that had been resisting the evidence of its own assumptions had been required by the weight of that evidence to begin the work of revision. Long enough finally to reach 7 names on an encrypted list and the woman who would build something from what those 7 people were and what they had survived and what they had demonstrated in conditions nobody had made easy for them that they were capable of carrying. Kate reassembled the pistol and set it on the bench. She sat for a moment in the dark with the Pacific moving steadily in the near distance and the stars doing what stars did above her, patient and indifferent and entirely present. Then she picked up the tablet. She opened the message. She read the 3 words one more time. They're ready. Recruit. She typed a response into the channel. 4 words. Understood. Starting tomorrow. 0600. She sent it. She put the tablet in her jacket pocket, picked up the pistol case and walked off the range. The gravel under her boots, the light of the base in the near distance. The sound of the water steady and unchanged, measuring time in its own way. Behind her, the target at the end of the lane held the grouping she had put there. Left-handed, precise. Her father's daughter. The work that outlasted the person doing it was already moving forward.